Welcome to the Coach Toolbox. I'm your host, Dr. Ajay Nangalia, a leadership coach and counselor. This channel supports your professional and personal development as a leader with research-based and practice-focused learning. And we bring you the best career and life advice from guests who've been there and done that successfully. And now, our session today.
Hi everyone, welcome to this conversation on bridging the gender balance from buzzwords to business impact. Now, this is an issue that has always been on the forefront for progressive companies, and today this issue has become even more critical. And we have with us an amazing guest who has the depth and width of perspective and insight on this subject, Sameer Chadha. And let me introduce Sameer briefly. Sameer Chadha is the Chief Executive Officer of KPMG Global Services India, which is a global in-house captive for KPMG, employing 11,000 employees across 4 locations in India. Sameer is also very passionate about driving an inclusive and a diverse workforce, and under his leadership, KGS has been ranked among the top companies to work for in India for 4 years in a row by LinkedIn, and also recognized, and this is really important, as one of the top 3 employers in the country for women, as well as for policies on inclusion and diversity by ASSOCHAM in 2019. Sameer is a chartered accountant and an alumnus of Delhi University's prestigious Sri Ram College of Commerce. Sameer, welcome.
Thank you, Ajay. Great to be on board. Always a little unnerving with that kind of a build-up, but but that's good. I think just I would like to say that we were actually ranked in the top 10 best working organizations for women in India last year by Avtar. I wish we were actually top 3, but we were top 10.
Oh, all right. Okay. My bad. And actually, I have not done Sameer's introduction at justice, but what I will do for our listeners is put up his LinkedIn profile link in the description of our podcast. So I encourage you to go check it out there. Now, one of the first things when we spoke about coming onto the show, Sameer was very excited to talk about diversity and inclusion, but this is such a wide area. So I thought we'd just focus on one aspect today, which is bridging the gender diversity gap, and then take the other aspects of D&I in future conversations. So perhaps our starting point for today's conversation is bridging this gender diversity. We are aware that it's only one small aspect of diversity and inclusion, but that's going to be the focus of our conversation today. So Sameer, with respect to the presence of women and their inclusion in leadership positions, where do you see the current state of affairs?
Yeah, so I think where we sit currently, there has, in my view at least, I've been now working for close to 30 years, right? The amount of focus that is there on, the broader topic of diversity and inclusion, and more specifically, this talk is about gender. The focus on that is quite incredible, really. So I do feel that this is really now a topic that gets discussed at the board level, at the C-suite. It's getting measured, and with all right-brained individuals, right, what gets measured gets done. And I think there is therefore a lot of optics around this entire thing. I really do think that there has never been a better time for competent women to get into the workforce. I think, whether there be flexible work policies, whether there be an enabling environment, whether there be leadership buy-in and support, it is really the strongest I have seen it in a long time. So that's a real positive.
Oh, that's such a lovely, positive, upbeat note to start on. So tell us a little bit more, building on this, in terms of the areas that you're seeing progress in, and of course, what are some challenges that are still there?
Yeah. So I think the progress is, as I said, Ajay, that the progress is clearly that there is a broad-based realization of this. There is a broad-based need for this, which is now articulated and which has been absorbed at the senior most levels in organizations. And it's, very apparent in the amount of effort that a lot of progressive companies are doing in trying to right the imbalances of the past and trying to get a semblance of diversity on multiple attributes going within organizations. That said, I do think that there are and we'll talk a little bit later, I guess, about some of the policies and frameworks and enabling environments that have been put in place. But to your specific question, I think the agenda is a very deeply still WIP agenda. And I'll give you a couple of interesting perspectives on this. So I have been, as you said, this is an agenda that I've been very passionate about for a long time. And mostly the industry refers to the agenda as the D&I, or the diversity and inclusion agenda. And KPMG refers to it as IND, and therefore it's inclusion and diversity. And you can say, well, it's a play on words, but I've come to realize it's really interesting. But one of the challenges is that the culture that you need to drive in an organization to make this succeed is what is the key part, because policies and frameworks, quite honestly, are fairly easily replicable between one organization and the other. There's really nothing very difficult in replicating policies, but I think the mindset to make those policies succeed, that is a difficult agenda. And therefore diversity is often about metrics, about getting numbers in. Inclusion is about mindsets. And that's why I feel inclusion and the mindset of driving inclusion is still a WIP agenda. And that's why, as I said, it's interesting that KPMG calls it inclusion and diversity. And the other thing I've been thinking of, so we've been at home now for 4 months, and let's see how long people will continue to be at home during this current pandemic. And one thing that I have realized, I'd like to believe a lot of men would have realized, is just the sheer amount of work that there is at home to make a home run smooth, right?
Absolutely.
It's incredible, right? I mean, sometimes, you don't really appreciate, my wife is a homemaker. I've got two sons, and, she stopped working after the second, after the first, well, at the time when my second son was born, she stopped working. But the sheer amount of work at home, right? And I feel that till there is equality of home responsibilities and the distribution of those, there is always going to be that challenge, because post marriage, post childbearing, ages and events, right? Women disproportionately share the burden of homework, elder care, child care, etc. So I think there are these challenges which are frankly not easy challenges at all to overcome, and therefore I think this is still a topic which continues, not in a BAU, it's already happening kind of a mode, but it's still getting a lot of effort, almost like a project, to make sure that it's moving in the right direction.
Yeah, yeah, you're so right. I mean, the sheer number of utensils that just never seem to end is not something one
Oh my
normally
gosh.
thought about. But now that I've been home for 4 months, minus the luxury of having support, I tell people would take one spoon and everybody share one spoon and one plate. I'm tired of washing bloody dishes all the time.
That's well said.
Okay, so yeah, we are. It is a work in progress. It is something that's top of mind for many progressive organizations. Yet, in what ways do you see structure of organizations and common leadership practices put women at a disadvantage?
So, see, again, my own sense on this is that historically, given that a lot of organizations have been male dominated, right, there is a lot of, there's a lot of history that is coming through in terms of organizational practices, organizational behaviors, and quite candidly, the mindsets of, individuals. And I think, your wife actually referred me to a really good book called The Fix by Michelle King, who's the Netflix diversity, the head of inclusion and diversity. And I think I'm somewhere midway through that book, and it talks very much about this entire topic. My sense is we have to, as leaders, right? And I strongly believe that this agenda has to be driven top down, which means me and my team, and they have to role model this entire thing. Because how do we make sure that we stand behind the small everyday things that happen, which kind of are sending subtle messages? There's this whole term of microaggressions, and how do microaggressions actually play out in the corporate life? But the point is that you sit in a meeting, and there is, let's say, one lady in a room, and either she's not allowed to speak, or she's not really addressed directly, or when she speaks, people try and speak over her. How do you address these kind of small microaggressions that happen every day? How do you make sure that, while you want to make sure that every employee is treated equally, you are also cognizant of the fact that, let's say, mothers have a slightly different set of dynamics to deal with, and you're more empathetic about that as an organization, right? Everybody needs outcomes, everybody needs output, but what do you need to do to make sure that you appreciate some of the challenges women face, definitely in different stages of their their life cycle in an organization and their lives, and how can you be more supportive? How can you, make sure that organizations and senior leaders, male leaders, are actually walking the talk? They are actually role modeling behaviors. How do you make sure that if you have, for example, KPMG has a women's network, that is chaired by one of my team members who's a male, right? So how do you make sure that you send out those kind of signals? How do you make sure that, when you have sexual harassment complaints that come through which are proved to be correct, that you're seen to be taking firm action, that you're seen to be taking, a no nonsense and a zero tolerance approach to these kind of subtle behaviors, which are not embedded discrimination, but that happen at a subtle level, and you have to make sure you call them out and you address them. So I think, the whole patriarchal concept of an organization, and how do you make sure that that doesn't come in the way of women who are trying to make careers. I think senior male leaders, and I view my role as the CEO of KGS as, right up there in terms of making sure that you role model absolutely the right behaviors, and you are totally unambiguous about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable.
So tell us a little bit more about some of the specific things that you and your team and that KGS do to implement this, because you must be doing something right, because it's being recognized by industry. You all are winning these awards. So can you share some things that would be, that would really give the rest of us, oh, okay, that's something to be done. That's something to be done.
So I think I'll address this in two parts. So one part is there is a policy framework. So, let's say we have flexible working policies, we have sabbatical policies. If a woman is expecting, we provide transportation to and from office as a routine. And if a woman is expecting, we'll make sure she's the only one, or, the cab occupancy is restricted. So you don't have like 3 or 4 colleagues sitting in a cab. So you afford that. You have footrests, you have, nursing stations, you have, you have policies constructed to make sure that women can actually feel the flexibility and use the flexibility. So, I'm not necessarily talking about the 6-month maternity leave and crashes. We did that long ago. They are now part of regulation in India. So that's something that everybody has to do. It's not something specific we are doing, right? But our point of view on this always is that how do you keep expanding the suite of policies you have to make it easier for women to have successful careers within an organization? So that's the policy part. And as I told you, policies are not particularly difficult to do. When you hear of a good policy in the market, it takes a bit of thought around it, and then it's easy to implement. The other important thing is, I am very clear about this, that it is something that is really important for us to drive as an organization, right? My team feels it's something very important to drive. We talk about it a lot. We make sure that we show up. So if there is a celebration of Women's Day and there are events that are happening, that somebody senior is in those events, they're making their presence felt. That, as I told you, the network is led by a leadership team member who is a man. The fact that we have absolutely zero tolerance towards any misogynistic behavior in the office place or any complaints that get made. And I think in the end, there is this continuous need to build a culture where it actually doesn't feel like you're having to put an effort, but it happens naturally. And for me, one of the big indicators is that when we run our colleague opinion surveys, okay, we very closely monitor what is, if you have 14 or 15 attributes that you ask colleagues to answer questions on, how do male colleagues kind of respond to them, and how do female colleagues respond to them? And in the survey we had last year, I'm delighted that there was actually almost no difference, marginal differences, or some differences here, some differences there, but no pattern. When we do our year-end ratings, when we are seeing promotions as an example, you try and see what percentage of women colleagues are getting promoted versus what percentage of male colleagues are getting promoted. Are there some unconscious biases playing out there? When you see attrition rates, you'll try and see, is there a variance in attrition rates, or are they largely the same? When you try and see ratings and rating curves, you'll try and make sure there's no distribution. So the point is, some of this is unconscious behavior not being actively done. You have to make sure you're watching the right metrics to make sure it's not creeping through, and you have to make sure you're setting the right culture along with a policy framework that in the end hopefully gives the right set of signals to women colleagues.
All right. So we have to look at it at the policy level. And the reality is that, of course, large part of leadership teams, majority are still men. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about men. Now, it's very clear that you as a human being, as an individual, are very passionate about diversity. and inclusion, or inclusion and diversity. Tell us a little bit about what drives you, that this has become so important for you. Now, normally, if you'd have said, I have daughters, I could have believed that. And that's typically something that drives men to be very women focused. But you have two big strapping boys. So where does this passion come from?
No, so see here, when I think about this, my own sense is why am I so behind the whole agenda? And I think of it as two, three things. One is it's quite simply and predominantly a talent access play. Okay, 50% of mankind, humankind is women. Then why kind of shut off one source of talent for you by focusing more on the on the male side of it? So that's one. The other is you know that we we all would, I'm sure, love to come to an organization where we can be who we are. And this is not just, we are talking about gender, but there are so many aspects of diversity, including racial, ethnic, sexual orientation, regions, etc., etc. So I'm sure everybody wants to come to a place where they don't have to conform to some kind of a stereotype, but they can bring their whole self to work. And then the point is that we all have customer bases, we have clients that we deal with, they are all diverse in the way they are. Why should we not mirror that? So I think these are two or three things. And my sense is, as I said, that and I smile when you say yes, I'm not behind this because I have two daughters and I want to make a better future. I have two sons, right? But interestingly, I do think that I have there is a female colleague, and she was telling me the other day that behind every successful woman is a father who is willing to break the stereotype. And I think that was
So true.
a
How
really
nice.
nice way of putting it, right? And I think so there is a lady who I've often who I think speaks very passionately on this topic. Her name is Apurva Parohit, and she is the CEO of Jagran Prakashan. She used to be the CEO of Radio City before, and she used to say always in talks that the best career decision a woman can make is to marry a supportive spouse. Okay, and that then is one part of the success formula. So again, for me, as I said, there are two or three reasons I'm behind the agenda. And again, I strongly believe that for this agenda to be successful, it requires executive focus, because a lot of people often get caught up in corporate lives around the business of business, right? Are we meeting the metrics around top line, bottom line, cost, etc., etc.? This is easy to get pushed to the side in competing priorities. And therefore, I think as long as there is executive focus and people know this is important, people will give it the attention it deserves.
All right. So we've understood how you think about it, but when you survey organization landscape, and I'm not talking specifically about your organization but across, because you're as a consultant, you have a wider perspective. What do you think men really feel about gender diversity, and especially men in India, if there is a difference?
Yeah, so I think that you touch upon an important topic, Ajay, because the thing is, every time I speak about this topic in a forum, I'm at pains to tell the men in the room that this is not about reverse discrimination. At times, I realize with so much focus on it, it can feel like it is reverse discrimination, and it's not. It's not trying to correct something, but it's almost discriminating now against men. And I am very clear in my mind, at the base of every attempt to correct ratios of women in the workforce is the fundamental tenet of competence. So I am very clear that we will not hire somebody because there is some metric we are going after. We are going to hire competent people, and hopefully we can hire competent women as much as we can hire competent men. So I think if the men understand that this is about meritocracy, and this is about not trying to give a faster track to women, but give an equal track to women. The fact is, whether we like it or not, another leader who I listen to and really admire is Indra Nui. And Indra Nui had said that the career clock and the biological clock are in complete conflict with each other. Okay. And the fact is, I do believe that, right? Till there is not equal sharing of work at home, the moment a woman gets married or a woman has children, right, there are those responsibilities which come through. So the idea is not to try and create a unequal or a faster track for women, but to create an equal field for women. And I think that message has to be made openly without trying to talk around it to men, so that they understand what this is all about. And therefore I feel this whole thing of the feeling of reverse discrimination can only go away if you feel it is actually meritocracy. Yes, it is the right thing to do. And the point is, well, I have a wife, or I have a mother, or I have a sister, or I have a daughter, and I would love for them to be in an organization which views things like this. So I think it is a, how do you win the minds of people? And by that, you have to be transparent about the messaging.
So true. And continuing around men. So, what can men do to go beyond their comfort zones or group think to make their women colleagues feel more included, especially when you have meetings or large gatherings where, men are clearly in the majority?
So I think the point is that you have to, first of all, leave your assumptions at the door. You, for example, if you are planning after office to go out for drinks or something, don't make the obvious assumption that a working mother will not want to participate because she has to get home. If there is a job which requires a lot of travel, okay, don't make the automatic assumption again that a woman is less likely to say yes to that job than a man is. So one is that you have to, in fact, there are a couple of really good podcasts on your channel, one by a lady called Sujata Narayan and another by a lady called Pallavi Shom, which I heard on your podcast. And Sujata Narayan said a very good thing. She said, sometimes I the way I try to approach this is that when I step into the door of the workplace, I do not think of myself as a woman. I think of myself as a colleague. And therefore I don't try and get too hassled about some things which go wrong, thinking, oh, it's going wrong because I'm a woman. So as an example, she said that if I don't get promoted, it's not, or if a woman doesn't get promoted, it's not as if there's something that is at play there. There are also men who don't get promoted as well. So you have to think of it as, that what is happening to me is happening as a colleague. And therefore, I think the reverse is that men should also think of women colleagues as ultimately colleagues. They're all colleagues, right? Now, you have to make sure that you are treating everybody fairly, and while you think everybody is a colleague and there's no difference, equally as you need to be aware of individual circumstances. In the case of a working mother, that means being a little more empathetic about a situation. But equally, if you have a male colleague who has an ailing parent and they are kind of taking care of that parent, you have to be equally empathetic in that situation as well. So I think I would ask male colleagues, get behind the agenda and own the agenda and own it visibly. I would say don't get into typical boy talk when you are in a larger forum which has women in it. Don't be inappropriate, don't make inappropriate comments, because fact of the matter is, even if sometimes people feel uncomfortable, if a senior enough person is saying it, people sometimes are hesitant to actually call it out or say that is a bad behavior. So I'm saying you have to be mindful of these things, that ultimately the workplace has to feel respectful for everybody in that workplace, and it has to be feeling fair for everybody in that workplace. So you need to do actions to make sure that that is happening. I used to have a colleague in a previous organization, and she'd come to me and say, if you don't mind, Samir, I'm not going to come to so and so town hall because I need to go and spend time with my daughter. Okay, I said, there is no need at all for you to apologize. The fact of the matter is, your personal time is your personal time. You can choose what you want to do with it. But equally, I don't want to be the one sitting making assumptions that she's not going to be wanting to come because she has a child at home. And therefore, I think you need to leave some assumptions aside. Plus, it's interesting in this book, The Fix, there is a lot of talk about how the same behaviors which are viewed as valuable in men are not viewed so valuably in women, because what you expect
Yeah.
from the two are very different. And there's this example that if a woman is assertive and she's, ambitious and she's career driven, somehow those are looked at as negative attributes. Versus if a man shows those attributes, it is seen as positive attributes. So I think there are these elements which need to be watched out for. And our organization, for example, invests a lot in unconscious bias training. Now, by their very definition, they're unconscious biases. But the point is, at least you're being made aware of them so that you can be consciously thinking about some of them when you're dealt with a situation where, as I said, you go to a party, okay, what kind of conversation are you happening, what kind of jokes are you cracking, how do you behave when you're had a couple of drinks, etc. It has to feel a psychologically and physically safe space for all colleagues, women or otherwise.
So true. So true. It has to be visible leadership behavior starting right from the top.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Good. So, what advice would you give women to grow and build their careers?
So I would say two, three things. I would say, first of all, back yourself and have confidence in your abilities. There is this anecdotal joke which says that if a man is offered a job which has 10 requirements and he knows two of them, or let's say five of them, he'll say, never mind, I learned the other five on the job. But if a woman is given the same job and she's good at eight of them, she'll say, I don't know two, and so therefore I'm not going to apply for it. So I would say, I've probably said the anecdote in the reverse order, but the fact is, men are far more likely to put up their hands for things they're not fully confident about, whereas women go for things where they're fully confident about. That's what the research tells you. So I would say, back yourself and have confidence in your ability. The other thing I would say is, I talk to a lot of women colleagues in office from time to time about how do they feel, do they feel any different? Do they feel they have, equal opportunities, etc. And one of the things I would tell women colleagues is, do not hesitate to create visibility for your own achievements. Okay. If you've done a great job in something, if you think you deserve a promotion, if you think your comp is a little, not where it should be, don't hesitate to talk about it. I've seen women often feel embarrassed about these things. They're less likely to talk about these elements. And for then, unless you have a supervisor who is, who says, okay, the person's doing a great job, the person's therefore going to get to where they have to get to, right? Those kind of supervisors, will always make you succeed. But sometimes supervisors overlook you, not because they're, biased or anything, but if you're dealing with X number of people, the person who comes and talks to you about it is something that sticks in your mind versus somebody who doesn't come and talk to you about it. So I would say, do not hesitate to create visibility. There's a difference between overselling your ability, which is not a good corporate trade at all, versus creating visibility and not being afraid to take credit for what is rightly due to you, right? And the third I would say is that for women colleagues who have reached a certain level of seniority in organizations, please pay it forward. Please lend a hand to other women colleagues. Please be role models. Please sponsor other women colleagues. Because if a working woman with two children has managed to make it to a senior role in a corporate, I'm sure she's a source of inspiration to many more women who don't have that, who have not reached that stage yet. And they're more likely to be a role model than a man who has two children, because you don't really know what experiences a woman colleague goes through. So I would say all senior women colleagues, or who are mid management and above, need to actually make sure that they mentor women colleagues, they sponsor women colleagues.
So true. So true. So, having said that, we are trying our best to create a culture which is conducive to reduce this gender diversity gap. But if there is some discrimination, what advice would you give women who might face some discrimination? How do they prepare or deal with it?
So the simple advice is two words, which is speak up. Okay. Now, behind that simple advice, there is a lot of cultural elements that have to be in place for people to be confident about speaking up. And that's going back to my entire conversation about, have I created a culture where women feel that if I speak up, it is actually going to be actually something is going to be done about it, and the organization is going to take it seriously, or is it just going to be heard and not acted on? So I think, if you see behaviors which are inappropriate, if you see actions which are inappropriate, please speak up. And for that, the organization has to do a lot of work to make sure that women feel trust in the organization to do the right thing. And trust in term comes from all of the things I've said about visibility, talking to the agenda, getting behind the agenda, getting visibly behind it, making sure you're getting the right policies in place, and so on and so forth. And one thing leads to another.
All right. All right. So, to first of all, to speak up. So, over the last 4 months, all of us have been affected by this pandemic. So, talk to us a little bit more about the impact this COVID-19 would have had on the women as their workforce and their return to the workplace. How do you see things? How do you see this pandemic affecting women specifically?
So I think the from a you know I think, if you, on a lighter note, if you were to ask my wife about it, she would feel really hassled about it, because she hates having everybody at home, which creates a environment for her which she just does not like. So she's, every time we extend the date of working from home, she's the one who's the saddest every time I tell her that. So she's not having a particularly good experience with having all the men in her life with her all the time. So that's on the lighter note. I think on a more serious note, uh, clearly the fact that working from home has turned out to be so successful at scale for an extended period of time, in my mind, can only be a big positive for women participation in the workforce, because we now know that you can do roles, from home for long periods of time with no, decline in output. And while some companies may have been on the fence on working from home policies or flexible policies, etc., I think that will change as a consequence of what we've just seen. So that is a big thing. Again, I would say here that having policies is easy, but if a woman colleague or asks for a reduced work week, or wants to work from home, or wants to go home early, or wants to go for a kids parent teacher meeting, and the manager either overtly or covertly through body language gives a negative signal on that, the policy dies there and then at the level of the individual who has said no. So while I do think that this will definitely make things flexible working arrangements far more acceptable, at the end success of any arrangement is a function of how people embrace it at the ground level.
And especially, I'm assuming men, because I would assume there is a larger proportion of men as managers and leaders.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
Yeah. So as we bring our conversation to a close, what are some messages that you'd like to leave with the men who are listening in to our conversation?
The same message that get behind the agenda, try and understand the agenda. Please don't view it as reverse discrimination, but view it as trying to create an equal path for everybody, and educate yourself about what women feel like. The easiest way to do it is to talk to women in your team, peers, friends, about what do they feel about, organizations, or else read about it. And, as I said, for me, hearing senior women leaders speak about these issues, I mentioned some of them, is very useful and always very informative. Reading books, trying to understand what it is all a question about widening your perspective on this. So I just ask men, educate yourself, get behind the agenda, and support it.
All right. And what are some key messages that you'd like to leave with our women listeners?
And, I guess a lot of it has been said over the course of this talk, but again, there has never been a more conducive environment for competent women to get into the workforce for the first time, to build careers, second careers. There is a lot of appetite in corporates right now for competent women. Believe in yourself, back yourself, and go for the opportunity that is sitting out there.
And on that positive and really confident note, I'd like to bring our conversation to an end. Is there anything I should have asked you which I didn't? Is there any one as a last point which needs to come out which you think would be of use?
No, I think the only thing I would say is that sometimes when, one thing, uh, people who know me know that I'm a big movie, Netflix, etc. buff, right? And every time I see a mainstream movie, which tries to break the gender stereotype, I am always, very enthused, because in the end, there are a lot of progressive companies, but equally there are people out there who may not be feeling so progressive. So when you see a movie like a Pink, and you see all of the elements in it, you see a movie like Thappad, and you see some of the messages that gives you. I recently saw an ad where, a man tells his father that I have now done so well in school and I've studied so much, I'm looking forward to my, masters. And the father tells him that इतना पढ़ के क्या करोगे बेटा, right? आगे जाके तो तुमने घर में ही बैठना है, right? And the ad is all about how would you feel it if the roles were reversed, and that's what you were being told if you're a woman, right, or you're a daughter. So I think mainstream media has a very important role in, making sure the right messages go out, so that a mirror can be held up to society and they can say, wow, you know you really didn't see it from that perspective. So I think that's what I would like to say in closing, Ajay.
All right. Thank you. Samir, it's been awesome having you on the show. It's been awesome talking to you. And I feel our conversation will be inspiring to all women leaders and also for men leaders. And I think it's going to be a huge factor in just bringing this subject out in the open so that it becomes a catalyst for everybody to talk about this. So thank you so much for being on the show with us.
Thank you, Ajay. Thank you always for making it so conversational, like all your podcasts. Really enjoyed being on it. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, Ajay.
And that's it for today. Thank you for listening. Please connect with us on coachtoolbox@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to follow, subscribe, and review this channel. Details of our ICF approved coach training programs and our services as executive coaches and coaching supervisors are on www.globalcoachtrust.org. See you in our next session.